That's where we'll be working from today, which is this idea of the Civil War. So we looked at the causes of the Civil War and have been looking at it, and we'll revisit it. But I do like to show you one of the things that confuses students is when they hear the word Confederate flag. So, you know, when I hear Confederate flag, I consider this. You guys hopefully can see this. But this actually isn't the Confederate flag. This is a Confederate battle flag. All right. So here is the very first flag of the Confederacy. You'll notice it has 7 stars, right? I think. Maybe this one has 8. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, not sure. Okay, that one was after the 8th secession. Here are the 11 states. So this is the second. This is the first official national Confederate flag. Anybody notice anything odd or troublesome about this flag? Very similar to the American flag, particularly blue in the corner, red and white stripes. So when it flies, what was the problem? People couldn't tell the difference. Like, is it an American flag flying or is it a Confederate flag flying? And that might sound funny if it weren't for the fact that the Confederates didn't have uniforms officially either. A lot of Confederates wore blue uniforms in the first year of the Civil War. Many of the Confederates were former American soldiers who wore their uniform as American soldiers. In the Battle of First Manassas, Jackson's men surprised the American Union forces because they pop up and they look like blue, like they're wearing blue. And then they attack them. They're like, oh my gosh, we thought y'all were on our team. Then here's the second national Confederate flag. Now we'll notice the incorporation of the stars and bars in it, right? Anybody guess why that's a problem? Why they don't keep that flag? The second national? Yeah, because from a distance, it looks like a white flag. All right, this looks like a white flag. And if you know anything about white flags, that's the surrender. So here you have the blood-stained third national Confederate flag, they call it, the blood-stained flag. And so that's the flag with the red stripe at the end of it. This is the picture of it when it was flying in Danville. So just a reminder, Danville served as the last capital of the Confederacy, which some people forget. It absolutely did, yeah. Jefferson Davis stayed here in Danville for a couple of weeks and had a capital here and cabinet here. And I'll explain why Danville was such an important city to the Confederacy, not just because of that flag or that building. Also, there'll be other flags you'll notice at times. There'll be a blue flag with a white star. That's a Confederate Navy flag. The Bonnie Blue flag, they call it. So the Confederates had lots of flags. They had flags with shamrocks on them. The North had flags with shamrocks on them. So you'll see lots of flags with different, like, paraphernalia on it. Yeah. Why does the American flag? That's just the one I picked at the time. That's actually 42. I think it's the right number of states. Oh. Yeah, at the time. Civil War. Yeah, because we didn't have 50 until 1948. And Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah territories weren't states yet. The Dakotas weren't states yet. So that's probably right. I forget exact number, but yeah. So yeah, it's close to that number, but I don't think exactly that. Now, the book opens with a question that I think is realistically a good question, and that is, how is secession really impossible geographically? And so part of that has to do with the fact that America's geography does not run suitable for division what way? Well, that is how it's more suitable for division, east and west. So in other words, we have mountain ranges that go, like the range runs north-south, so you could be on either side of that, or the Mississippi River on either side of that. But when you get to Kentucky, do you automatically, when you cross the Ohio River, say, oh, okay, now I'm in the north? When you pass from Maryland or from Virginia into Maryland, it's not like you go through an effect that you're like, oh, I'm in the north now. You know, my sons asked me, where does the South start? And I said, the South starts today south of Charlottesville. You know, like, in other words, the Charlottesville community and around the city of Charlottesville are very much not historically like Southern people, you know, today Southern people, or back in the past Southern people, rather. That being said, Robert E. Lee was from Fredericksburg, and his mansion was at Arlington, which was right, in Fairfax County. So Virginia is very much a part of the Confederacy, but there's no sort of like obvious distinction geographically. Okay. Plus, the sheer size of our various states created sort of an impossibility of organizing on a confederation size, because what happens is, this is why Madison's Federalist 10 was so smart, is that if you start breaking it apart, you create a precedent that what's okay to break things apart, right? And so realistically, I tell students, every year this, had the Civil War ended with the Confederacy victorious, or had there been no Civil War at all, today Virginia would be like Guatemala, because the Confederacy would have ultimately split apart under the principle of secession. It would have seceded from itself. And so Texas, look at the size of Texas, y'all. It's like Europe. So Texas would have said, if we're not going to be in America, we might as well just be what? South Carolina threatens on several occasions to secede from the Confederacy. So the principle of secession is fundamentally flawed, because it means like you can just tear the whole thing apart. But guys, I do need to emphasize, nationalism comes in two ways. Nationalism can bring people together and create a nation, think Italian unification or German unification, same exact time period in history. And it can also rip countries apart based on differences of who the people are in the country. Think Austria-Hungary, right? The Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the 15 countries that we used to be the Soviet Union, right? So secession is a form of nationalism, but the nationalism it is sectional in nature. It's like saying our section should be a separate what? Country. And that is one of the fundamental debates of this whole period. Okay. All right. So what are the four major national questions raised by secession? Well, one of the things that really annoyed Northerners is Southerners owed a large section of debt. And by the way, guess what they do when they secede? They say, we don't own that money anymore. We don't owe that money anymore, right? So obviously they're going to pay the federal government money back if they feel like they don't owe them any money, right? So that of course, after the Civil War, do you think they had to pay their debt? Yeah. How would territories be divided? In other words, weren't there parts of the West that were not officially states yet that couldn't secede? Territories couldn't secede. So what would be the fate of the territories? All right. If the fugitive slave question was resolved by the Compromise of 1850, which it wasn't, keep in mind the fugitive slave law said if found in a runaway slave, what did you have to do? Send them back, right? Well, now you wouldn't even have to send them back because you weren't in the same country anymore. So that wouldn't have helped Southerners, runaway slaves. But really, the biggest problem the Civil War would create, I think, long term, had it been effective. In other words, had the South seceded, then we would have become Europe. You understand? And not only would we have become Europe, we would have become far more conflict oriented between each other. So there would have been border disputes. There would have been different commercial exchanges. Slavery would ultimately have faded away, ultimately. And that would have created greater hardship for African Americans, right? The North prospered as a result of the Civil War, right? So really the North probably would have survived like Canada. Right? That's the analogy I often make, like just the other side of the Great Lakes. But the South would have probably splintered into Central America. You understand? And that's not a great future at all. All right. So reminder, the issue that led to the violence of the Civil War was something that Buchanan could not reconcile. And that was federal forts. Keep in mind, that's U.S. federal property in southern states. So what the Confederate troops, the Confederate state militias, Confederate Ultimate Army did was occupy forts that had been made by the United States military. But which fort refused to surrender, like didn't want to give up? Fort Sumter. And because of its location, which is Charleston, South Carolina, it was too strategically important for the Confederates to just let sit there. So this is Lincoln forcing the Confederates' hands. He's saying, I'm going to resupply these folks with food, right? Not with, soldiers, and not reinforcing it, just resupplying it so they don't starve to death. And then what did the Confederates do? They shot it. And so when they shot cannons at Fort Sumter, and when they attacked the American flag, that infuriated tens of thousands of Northerners. Before this, a lot of Northerners were like, nah, let him go. It's after the attack on Fort Sumter that Lincoln is able to call up troops because he has cover, because he can clearly state the Southern states are in rebellion, right? Not just simply trying a different political exercise. And folks, I want to tell you about Abraham Lincoln. He will never, ever accept, he calls it a sophism. You guys know what a sophism is? S-O-P-H-I-S-M. And he calls it an ingenious sophism. A sophism sounds smart, right? The definition, if you look it up, it says sounds smart, but it is a fallacy. It is used to deliberately deceive. So he says, I will not accept the sophism that the states can simply leave the Union. You understand? What formed the Union? This is where people get so confused. And man, this is where words matter, y'all. Precision of words. No, a group of states formed the Articles of Confederation. A group, but it's important. Now, it may be a lawyer's. This is what the Southerners called it. They called it a lawyer's trick. It's not a lawyer's trick. A group of states formed the Articles of Confederation. You read the preamble to the Constitution. It says, "We, the people of the United States of America." Right? The people formed the what? And he will argue that the South never seceded. In other words, a state cannot leave the Union. The state is part of the Union. It's like your toe leaving your body of its own volition. Your hand walking away on its own, right? He says it's not the states that are in rebellion. He says it's people within the states that are in rebellion. You see the difference? So for him, this is about rebellion by Southern people against the United States government, not states trying to withdraw. He says that's not an option. Regardless of what your state people claim, that's not a power they can do. The state didn't create it. They stopped being a state of what pre-existed when they created what? No, not when they created the Articles of Confederation. See, here's the problem. It is like Southerners were still living under the Articles of Confederation, right? Like the Articles of Confederation was a league of friendship of literally what type of states? Independent states, right? That is not what the U.S. Constitution is, argued Lincoln. Lincoln said we're one nation made up of many people who live in what? States. You get the idea? Let this come into your head too. Before the Civil War, the normal way people described America is, listen to this now. These United States of America are bound to honor our treaty. These United States of America should go to war with France. These United States of America are. What's that? Is that singular? It's plural. These United States are. That's how people spoke. That's how they talked about America. They said, these United States, all right? But after the Civil War, the language becomes, the United States of America is. You hear the difference? So the states are not relevant to the what word? United. That's what he'll argue. Now, of course, it's relevant, but it's secondary. There's this thing called the Supremacy Clause. You remember me telling you that? The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The states are secondary. So Lincoln refuses to accept that the states even secede at all, but rather it's the people of the states in rebellion. So Lincoln provisions Fort Sumter, not reinforces it. Why is it good that they attacked for the Yankees? Why is it good for the Union that the Confederates attacked this fort? Say it again. Well, they can call it a rebellion. There was no rebellion really up to this point. See, that's what I like about telling you about Lexington and Concord. Your average American in Massachusetts, while not happy about the presence of troops in Boston, aren't doing much about it. But when an army marches through their backyard, what do? They get ticked off. The average Northerner didn't care much about the fact that Southerners were leaving. They thought it was sad and they didn't like it, but they couldn't do much about it. They didn't like them shooting at who, though? Americans, American soldiers, American flag waving soldiers, right? So this fired up, otherwise, what's our word for the forever? Ambivalent American people, right? The American people are like, man, I want to go about my business. But this, you can't shoot at Americans. You can't do that. Okay? So how did Lincoln respond? What did he do? It's a crucial couple actions he takes as a response to Fort Sumter. Keep in mind, if you're looking at the date of Fort Sumter, bad news. Guess who ain't in his session? Guess who's not there? Nobody wants to guess. Congress is not in session. So that means who's kind of solo winging it? Lincoln. So Lincoln's going to have to make decisions. So what's he going to do?
He calls for troops.
All right. So the first thing he does, so let's call this Lincoln's response. All right. Lincoln's response is, now keep in mind, Buchanan can't respond this way, particularly because he has, all right, let me write down first of all. Lincoln's response is to call up 75,000 volunteers. Okay, 75,000 volunteers to suppress the what? The rebellion, rebels. And then so I said Buchanan can't do this because first of all, we only had about 15,000 men in the entire American army. And where were like 90% of them stationed? Now, a good number were in the South. Actually, that's a fair point. At some of like VMI. But no, not South, West. They're fighting the Apaches. They're fighting the Sioux. So the Americans are, the army, what little army we have, is way out West fighting with Native Americans already. All right. So we need an army, we being the Union. He calls up 75,000 volunteers. And then what's the other thing he creates or does?
Puts the United States under martial law.
Oh, wow. That'd be a big jump. Well, how do you get that? Is that a theory?
Didn't he do that later on?
Yes, very good. Later on, he is going to do some martial law. That would be really early. I think he would probably lose more people than he gained if he did that right out the gate. But you're right. Down the road, he's going to do it. But timing is everything. So he creates a what? Now, both of these actions are considered unconstitutional at the time. But later Congress will approve both these things. In other words, he doesn't get congressional approval to do these two things. But he considers as his role of commander-in-chief his authority to do this. You understand? So he uses his power as commander-in-chief, and there are lots of books written on Lincoln's use of power. He's one of the most expansion use of power of any president we've had, so far, even Jackson. But he calls up these troops because who's not there to authorize it? Congress isn't there to say, yes, you can do this. So these are his immediate reactions. What does that then lead to? So the upper South will then say, okay, we're done. Because you're obviously going to wage war on the cotton states, right? If you're going to do it, you're probably going to come through us on the way to doing it. So these four states too will secede. And I do think that unfortunately for President Lincoln, he didn't have much of a choice here. Like if he doesn't respond at all, then that's it. That's the end of the South. He loses, The Confederacy are happy to see Virginia join. Confederates move their capital to where? To Richmond. Yeah, Montgomery was too far. Yeah, very good. Montgomery was too far away from where the fighting was going to be. Okay. Plus, this is, Virginia is one of the great states of history, and this is where you'd want to be. So definitely want to be familiar with this. Now, that is interesting, and I do want you to remind yourself, and I'll just make a reminder. There are at least 5 states, or new state, and 4 states, have slavery that don't secede. Now, I'm including in that number West Virginia. West Virginia will form itself during this period. Okay.
And then the other states are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware.
Very
right?
good. Right. And that's what you need to know. Very good. Those are the so-called border states. I mean, that's their official name during the war, the border states. And they are going to be crucial, really, really important, because, there's a line in the book I've always liked to quote, and that is that Lincoln said he hoped to have God on our side, but we got to have Kentucky, and it has to do with all that Kentucky has to offer, not only its water, the rivers that it controls, but its horses. Keep in mind, horses are crucial during this war. So now I want to get into, just here in the last 8 or 9 minutes, what your textbook calls the balance of forces. All right. So definitely know, the Brothers' Blood section here. And keep in mind, by having the border states, by including the border states, I guess I should do this as its own entry, shouldn't I? So let's do that. Let's put the border states on a map and talk about their value. Border states. Here comes the map of the border states. I haven't updated this in a while, so this is fun to do. I always like to incorporate new stuff. So here's the border states. Keep in mind again that West Virginia chooses to not secede. So they're going to be like, nah, we're not interested in that, you slave-owning nasty people. All right. And they're the border states, excuse me. And you should know that what they have to offer is quite important. So what do they have to offer? Let's take it from the text. You guys are reading along, or am I just being optimistic? So this part of America for us is home to a lot of people. So the population of the border states, the book talks out half of the entire Confederacy. Half the entire white Confederacy. I'll point that out. So that obviously means a whole lot more troops. Okay. Manufacturing capacity. Okay. Double. Just these 4 states doubled the South. 5 states. All right. Waterways. The 2 most valuable waterways in the war are not going to be the Mississippi or the Potomac, but the Ohio, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee. These are going to be the rivers that we're going to fight for the most. Okay. And in West Virginia, well, they got hillbillies. All right. But, that was I forget how many counties it was, but it was a bunch of, it becomes a free state. So I shouldn't call it a slave. I'll just go back over here and say 4 states have slavery. Because West Virginia will be a free state. And they can't stand like the rich planter class. Now, you mentioned martial law, Chris. This is one of those places where Lincoln will do this in some of these border states, particularly Maryland. Lincoln cannot lose Maryland because if you know anything about D.C., it's surrounded by Maryland and Virginia. So if you lose Maryland and Virginia, then your capital is in foreign country, so to speak, or enemy country. So, yeah, he's going to use martial law at times, but, not throughout the whole war. So yeah, I would definitely be familiar with this. Okay. And I want to point out something not only about the border states, but also some northern states that your book mentions too. And that is the butternut region of the north is a problem for him. So what's the butternut region? It's southern Ohio.
Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois.
It's southern Ohio and Indiana, right, particularly. Oh, well, that's it, fellas and ladies. Time's up. If I don't talk to you anymore, have a happy, happy holiday, a Merry Christmas, and a freaking great New Year, 2021, right? But I will be available tomorrow for a while. Take care, everybody. Much love. I'll